To fully grasp the gravity of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, a dive into the historical context proves essential. Let's rewind to the early 20th century, where the Indian subcontinent was under the rule of the British Empire. The struggle for independence was steadily gaining momentum, with voices of dissent echoing from every corner. The colonial masters, however, were not about to relinquish their hold without a fight. In the midst of this tension, in the year 1919, the British colonial government introduced a controversial piece of legislation known as the Rowlatt Act. This law was a response to the growing unrest and resistance among Indians, and it was designed to suppress any opposition to British rule. The act essentially gave the British authorities the power to arrest and incarcerate Indians without trial if they were suspected of sedition. Imagine the outrage and resentment this act fueled among the Indian populace. Their basic human rights were being stripped away, and they could be thrown in jail without any evidence or trial. This was not just a law, it was a blatant symbol of the oppressive nature of the British rule. What followed was a series of protests and demonstrations across the country. Indians of all backgrounds united in their opposition to the Rowlatt Act. The atmosphere was tense, and the resentment towards the British was palpable. The Indians, despite their peaceful means of protest, were met with brutal force and repression from the British authorities. In the northern city of Amritsar, this resentment culminated in a large gathering of Indians at a public garden known as Jallianwala Bagh. They were there to protest the Rowlatt Act and the arrest of two popular leaders, but they were also there to celebrate the Punjabi New Year. Unbeknownst to them, their peaceful gathering was about to take a tragic turn. The stage was set for a confrontation, and the spark ignited in the form of a peaceful gathering at Jallianwala Bagh. On April 13, 1919, a crowd gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden in Amritsar, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. This was a day of significance to the Indian community. It was Baisakhi, a major festival celebrated to mark the harvest season and the Sikh New Year. But the air was not just filled with festive cheer. There was a sense of defiance, a spirit of protest. The people were there to peacefully express their dissent against the oppressive Rowlatt Act imposed by the British, which allowed them to detain Indians without trial. As the crowd assembled, the atmosphere was filled with a mix of cheerful festivity and resolute determination. Men, women, and children, all united under a common cause, blissfully unaware of the horror that was about to descend upon them. Enter Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, a man who would go down in history for his infamous role in the events that were about to unfold. Accompanied by 50 soldiers, Dyer arrived at Jallianwala Bagh that fateful afternoon. The Bagh was surrounded by high walls on all sides with only a handful of narrow entrances, making it a veritable trap. Without a single warning, Dyer ordered his troops to line up at the main exit. He then gave the command that would forever tarnish his name and scar the collective memory of a nation: the order to fire on the unarmed crowd. The soldiers, armed with Lee Enfield rifles, obeyed. Bullets rained down on the terrified crowd, the echoes of gunshots drowned out by the screams of the innocent. The people panicked. They had come to protest, to celebrate, not to die. But there was no escape. The high walls of the Bagh, once a comforting enclosure for peaceful gatherings, now turned into a deadly trap. The narrow exits were blocked by the relentless gunfire. Some tried to climb the walls, others jumped into a well in the garden in a desperate bid to escape. But the bullets didn't discriminate. They cut down everyone in their path. Meanwhile, Dyer stood his ground, showing no remorse, no hesitation. He later stated that he was convinced he did the right thing, that his intention was to strike terror into the hearts of the Indians. And strike terror he did, but also sparked a flame of resistance that would eventually lead to India's freedom. The firing continued for about 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to those trapped within the garden's walls. By the time the guns finally fell silent, The Bagh was a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies lay strewn across the garden, the air heavy with the stench of blood and gunpowder. In just 10 minutes, hundreds lay dead and 1,000 more injured, marking one of the darkest days in Indian history. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre did not merely end on the day of the shooting, its consequences rippled through time. In the direct aftermath of the tragedy, the echoes of gunshots were replaced with an oppressive silence. Punjab, once a bustling province, was put under martial law by the British. The people of Punjab, still reeling from the massacre, were subjected to public floggings and a crawling order, which forced them to crawl on all fours on a street where a British woman was assaulted. These punitive measures were a chilling reminder of the authority the British exerted over the Indian populace. The massacre had reverberations that extended far beyond the boundaries of Punjab. It shook the very core of the nation, causing a ripple effect of outrage and sorrow. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire across India, sparking widespread condemnation of British rule. The international community was not deaf to these cries. The ruthless brutality of the incident sent shockwaves overseas, leading to a surge of sympathy for the Indian cause. As the wave of public outrage swelled, the British government was forced to establish the Hunter Commission to investigate the incident. The commission's findings were a mixed bag. While it mildly reprimanded Brigadier General Dyer for his actions, it stopped short of outright condemning him. This lukewarm response was met with disappointment and further anger by the Indian public, who had hoped for a more decisive verdict. But the wheels of justice, slow as they may be, were set in motion. Eventually, the British government censured Dyer. He was relieved of his command and forced to retire. However, this dismissal was far from a victory. Many in India and abroad felt it was a mere slap on the wrist for a man responsible for such a heinous crime. Yet amidst this grim backdrop, a spark was ignited. The massacre and the subsequent events had a profound impact on the psyche of the Indian people. It served as a rallying point, bringing together diverse sections of society in shared outrage. The call for self-rule grew louder, gaining strength and momentum. The massacre had inadvertently sown the seeds of unity and resolve in the hearts of the Indian populace. Prominent leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore renounced their British titles in protest. This act was symbolic of the growing disillusionment with the British rule and the rising tide of nationalism. The massacre had become a catalyst, speeding up the journey towards India's independence. While the massacre was a horrific event, it sparked a nationwide movement and strengthened the resolve for independence. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, a dark chapter in India's history, was a turning point that set the stage for a determined struggle that would eventually lead to independence. Its echoes continue to remind us of the heavy price of freedom and the indomitable spirit of those who fought for it. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre is a grim reminder of the price paid for freedom. A pivotal point in India's history, it was a tragedy that shook a nation to its core and spurred a collective desire for independence. Let's revisit the key points we've discussed. Long before the massacre, India was under British rule, with the colonial power's iron fist suppressing the rights and freedoms of the Indian people. This was the historical context that set the stage for the harrowing events of that fateful day. April 13, 1919. A peaceful gathering was taking place in Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden in Amritsar. Unbeknownst to the attendees, a massacre was about to unfold. British troops, led by General Dyer, opened fire on the crowd, leaving hundreds dead and thousands wounded. It was a day of horror and bloodshed that seared itself into the collective memory of a nation. In the aftermath of the massacre, shockwaves of outrage and grief swept across India and the world. The brutality of the event galvanized the Indian people, fueling their desire for freedom and independence. It sparked widespread protests and marked a turning point in India's struggle against British rule. The significance of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre in India's struggle for independence cannot be overstated. It was a pivotal event that highlighted the oppressive nature of colonial rule and ignited a unified call for freedom. It reminds us of the high price paid for the liberty we often take for granted. In conclusion, the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre stands as a dark chapter in history, a testament to the courage and resilience of those who endured such atrocities. It's a story of struggle, sacrifice, and ultimately triumph in the face of adversity. Remembering the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre is not just about recalling a dark day, but acknowledging the sacrifices made in the pursuit of freedom.